well, when are you going to use the actual course material in real life? And that by that test, then people usually like, yeah, well, yeah, probably never. Every now and then someone will give a bizarro story about how, well, once in my whole life I used something that I learned in a political science class, and so that means the whole process was worthwhile, right? And so like in the book, I actually tell this anecdote. There's a guy who said, look, it turned out it was really useful for me to learn French in high school. I'm like, oh, it was? And he says, yeah, because once I was at Charles de Gaulle Airport and there was an announcement that my flight was moved to a different gate or something like that. And if I didn't speak French, I would have missed that, and then I would have missed my flight. Like, so it was worth spending 3 or 4 years studying French in high school to avoid missing one flight decades later. That sounds like a great deal to me. Come on, right? So that's where I went and compared these arguments to the show Hoarders. Where there's a reality show about people who have like giant stacks of phone books and they're like filling their house. And again, if you go and ask people like, well, why can't we just throw it out? The standard answer of these people is, I might need it.
Right.
I might need it. And it's like, well, strictly speaking, I guess that's true. There is a chance you'll need your trash. Maybe you'll need a phone book to crush an intruder, right? And that'll be just what you needed at the very time. But come on, that is not a sensible reason to hoard phone books, right? And a sensible person weighs the probability and the cost before when they're doing this stuff. So I'd say the same thing for course material. Now, another story that people have is that, all right, sure, fine, you're right, you caught us, you're not going to use political science in real life, but they say you're learning how to learn, you're acquiring critical thinking skills, right? And, this is an interesting story. It's one that teachers generally just assume to be true, but there is a whole discipline that studies this and tries to measure it. It's called educational psychology. And what I say, if you go and read them, they're very pessimistic about these arguments, and they just don't find much evidence that it's true.
Yeah, and for my own bias and my own personal experiences in the circle of people that I keep around me, the idea that students are learning critical thinking skills is totally bizarre. There's not critical thinking skills from the students. And I'd say there's not a lot of critical thinking skills being demonstrated from even the professors. Yeah. It's like the idea that you're learning something from this group of people that maybe they don't even manifest the skill themselves is completely ridiculous to me.
Yeah, I mean, so since you were talking about being devil's advocate, let me play devil's advocate against myself here.
Okay.
And right, and you can say, all right, look, compared to what? All right, you may say college students barely engage in critical thinking, but you know how little critical thinking high school students engage in, right? And I do talk about research on this, and it is true that if you give plausible tests of critical thinking, and especially the ones I like are ones where they don't tell you to do critical thinking, they just give you problems and see what you do with them, right? Well, you'll see that people with more education generally get higher scores on these tests. But here's the interesting thing in the research, and now I will break character and go back to being me, is that they generally find that there's very little improvement between freshman and senior years. Right. So what's going on is rather that the people with better critical thinking skills more likely to be to advance to the next stage, but it doesn't seem like they're actually being transformed in the process. Rather, they're just using the advantages that they had when they arrived.
Exactly. And so how do you try to sort out that question? Is it the case that the people who go into college are naturally those that are going to have some greater ability versus they actually learn something there? Like, is that how do you even approach trying to answer that?
Well, I mean, what researchers usually do is they try to get a measure of how good you were when you started and then compare it to how good you are when you finished. So so that study that I was mentioning did exactly that. Another approach that I use is this. We just go and measure the totality of what adults know and then say school could not have caused more than 100% of that.
Okay.
All right. And for many subjects, this will give you the answer of school teaches essentially nothing because adults know essentially nothing about the subject.
Right. Even
subjects where people spend years studying in school. So the one that I think is most shocking is for foreign languages. Typical high school student in the U.S. will do 2 years. If you're going to college, probably 3 years or even 4 years. And yet if you go and actually just ask American adults whether they learn to speak a foreign language very well in school, under 1% say yes.
Wow.
Under 1%. So we're not talking about they spent 5 weeks in school on it and they didn't learn to speak it very well. We're talking about years and years, and yet people, by their own admission, their own self-evaluation, which of course tends to be inflated, say that they just didn't learn to speak it very well.
Man.
And we can see very, very similar things for history, for civics, for science. If you give American adults the easiest conceivable questions on these subjects, I mean, just stretch your imagination. What is the dumbest question I can ask about these subjects? And again, I'm talking, like a literal question that is included in one of the main surveys is, does the Earth go around the sun or the sun go around the Earth? Questions like this, like on average, Americans will be able to get half of them right, roughly.
Now,
So
do you put stock in something like that? And that's hard. That's hard to conceive that it is actually the case that half of the people we're talking. I don't know if that were generalized to the public. 150 million people don't know that the Earth goes around the sun.
Yeah. So again, that's one where you might think people are just hastily not answering the question, but no, I mean, do antibiotics kill viruses? Another question on the science test.
Right.
All right. Everything is radioactive. That's a fun one. True or false? False. Actually true. Everything's radioactive.
That makes me think, though, that maybe I could see an answer to those questions being answered that way, is to say that people treat those things as a game, it's like satirical what if humor, like, what the heck? Yeah, sure. Everything's radioactive. Whatever. I'm going to go grab some coffee after this. Don't care.
Yeah. So again, it's true that they don't care very much, but is reflective of the knowledge that they don't have, right? They don't have knowledge because they don't care. Right? Despite the fact that they were made to study this for years in almost any education program in America.
No, I mean to say I'm being optimistic here. I'm thinking maybe they don't care about the questionnaire.
Yeah.
Maybe they're
they know the answer and they're giving false answers for fun.
I'm hoping that's what's going on.
Yeah, there's a few trolls, but no, I mean I don't think that's likely to be true. Like for any significant degree. I mean, again, like there's a whole body of research on when do people lie to researchers.
Right.
And basically, people lie when the question's uncomfortable or awkward. But on the other hand, if their pride's on the line, if it's I want to impress people, people try.
Interesting.
I mean, here's a funny thing: IQ tests are predictive, even though there's generally no financial reward for doing well on that IQ test.
Right.
And and what's going on is people don't want to look stupid. It's embarrassing.
Well,
I'll say I don't like taking IQ tests because I'll feel embarrassed if I don't do well enough. It's like I'm smart, right? And then no, you're not. I'm like, oh man, so don't give me the test.
So you also mentioned, so that was the one hypothesis or the one way of testing what people learn. The first one that you mentioned was testing it before and then after, and I think about my own experience again. And what I'm sure is a lot of people's experience is when I went in, I got to start college young. I started when I was 16, and I didn't really care that much about getting, A's, I would say. I was getting B's and whatever. It was fine. I was interested in the martial arts, doing other things. But I had a girlfriend at the time that was a straight A student, and she came to the school that I went and was getting straight A's, and I thought, you know what? I think that's a good idea. I kind of like this idea stuff a lot. I think I'm going to start getting straight A's. And so I started becoming a straight A student. But that's not because of the educational system. So if somebody went in and saw my performance coming in and then went out, saw my performance coming out, they would go, oh, look, we have changed this Steve Patterson. Now he's a critical thinker, and he wasn't before. But that's just not true at all. It's a totally unrelated experience about a personal relationship that, changed my grades.
I mean, even in your story, it seems like when you decided to become a straight A student, you probably started learning more, right?
So here's what I did is I learned how to regurgitate very well. So I learned how to get A's. Now, I don't exactly equate that with learning, but I guess it's learning one one thing.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing: even just regurgitation requires a lot of knowledge, and just being able to tell a professor what he wants to hear requires a lot of knowledge.
Okay. Yes.
Knowing my philosophy professor is a utilitarian, so he's going to want a utilitarian answer.
Right.
Most people could not do that. Right, most people could not successfully tell the teacher what he wants to hear because they're so clueless. And I'm not even talking about most college students. I don't think if you went and told the college students, but for a typical ethics class before the final exam, all right, kids, remember, the professor's utilitarian, so tell him what he wants to hear. That's really helpful.
Well, my point in saying that though is that if somebody were to try to gauge my intelligence or by whatever metric going into college, it would look very different coming out of college. But that's because my values changed.
Right. And you probably actually an intelligence test wouldn't say that you had gone up very much, but a knowledge test would.
Right.
And that's at least sort of the low bar for what education is supposed to accomplish, is just to enhance your knowledge of the subject you studied. One of the main results that I'm talking about is actually there's for most subjects, there's a little sign even that low bar is passed. Again, it's likely that people knew more material on the day of the final exam, but again, the reason why I focus on what adults know is that there's no reason for employers to pay you for what you used to know.
Right, exactly.
So if you want to say that education raises earnings by teaching people stuff, you need to show that the knowledge is retained into adulthood. And that's what we really rarely see, or see just to a very small degree for most subjects.